So welcome everybody to today's webinar. Kirsty's already welcomed you. We're really glad that all of you are joining us on the call today. My name's Liz, Liz Weaver, as you know. To start off, I'd like to just recognize the supporters that we have at Tamarack who make these webinars possible. Our supporters are the Maytree Foundation, the J.W. McConnell Family Foundation, and the Ontario Trillium Foundation. And you know, at Tamarack, we're always appreciative of their ongoing support for our work and the opportunity to kind of connect with you, our members. Kirsty mentioned about tweeting, and we welcome your tweets. So you can use the Twitter hashtag Tamarack Connect, and if you want to tweet to Paul or I directly, Paul's Twitter handle is @PaulBourne, and mine is @WeaverWorks. We have put the recording on for the call, so those of you that joined early heard us do that. And normally with these calls and these webinars, we record them and then we share them more broadly with the folks that aren't able to join us. So I'm going to now launch into the official part of our webinar. So welcome to today's seminar or webinar, Community Change Lessons Learned in 2014. Paul and I were chatting about, some of our thoughts and some of our reflections on what has happened at Tamarack and, the conversations that we've had with some of you and others across different communities over the last year, and we thought it would be great to kind of get together at the end of the year and get together with you guys and talk about what we've been thinking about in terms of trends that we're seeing, some of the resources that we think you would be interested in following up about, and then highlights from some of our experiences over the past year and the amazing people that we've met and the programs that we've engaged with. So that's essentially what we're going to do today. For those of you that have never met Paul or myself, and I don't think there's very many of you on the call that haven't, here are pictures of us. So you can see on the one side is Paul, and on the other side is a picture of myself. And these are, pictures that we've taken over the course of the last year. So these are your webinar hosts. What we thought we would do in terms of the topics for today's webinar is that we would kind of look at the top trends. We would spend some time thinking about, the lessons that we've learned, that Paul has learned, that I've learned, that we've been thinking about. Talk about some of the observations that we have about the global perspective. We put together a list of resources that you can use, but we really welcome you to use the chat box and to share any other resources that you've come across that you think as actually things that you've been reading, things that you've been thinking about, a tool or a resource that you might want to share with your colleagues on the call. Tamarack is really about the co-generation of knowledge, and so we're looking at this webinar as an opportunity not only to give you our reflections, but really to learn from all of you guys about what you've been thinking about or reading or considering as well. And then finally, we want to open it up to hear about what you're learning and what your big ideas are. Paul, anything you want to add here in terms of the webinar topics?
Well, we think it's important to reflect at the end of a year to ask ourselves these broader questions. What's going on? What's changed? And part of this was sparked when we were all together at the Collective Impact Summit in September, when we asked thought leaders there about what they thought the future of collective impact might be, and helped us to try to understand that in a deeper way. And so this seminar, this time together really, is to do some of that reflecting. And I know that Liz and I are going to share our viewpoints, but do send yours in the chat box, and let us hear from you what you think is going on. What are some of the major trends? What are some of the key things you're learning? And we'd love to be able to work with those and have Kirsty post those in a blog later on that you can find at tamarackcci.ca.
Yep, great. So now we just want to tell you a little bit about Tamarack. Many of you are really familiar with our work, but maybe only a portion of our work, not our full picture at Tamarack. So Tamarack, our overall mission is the co-generation of knowledge for social change, and our deepest hope is really focusing ultimately on moving the needle on poverty, which is some work that we've been involved in for the last 12 years at Tamarack. We support 3 online learning communities, and these communities are really targeted at particular pieces of the work that we find really important and critical, and really help us deepen our understanding about how social change happens and how we are learning about it through your experiences and through your engagement. The first community is for collaborative leaders like yourselves, and this learning community is really designed to look at, what knowledge are you wanting to learn more about, what are some of your experiences, and how can we share this so that we're not continually reinventing the wheel, but that we're gaining momentum and moving forward faster, and this is called the Tamarack CCI community. The second community that Paul has just taken over the leadership for is our community that is focused on multi-sector roundtables, really reducing poverty in cities across Canada. And this is our Vibrant Communities work. Tamarack has been engaged in this work for more than 12 years, initially with 13 communities, and now we're scaling up to more than 100 communities. And there's lots of really great resources on comprehensive community change and reducing poverty on that website. And then the final website is a website focused on deepening community. And Paul, maybe you can share a little bit about the focus of deepening community.
Liz, I'd love to, and I'd love to do that a little later on, but I'm just thinking we're 10 minutes into this call. Let's get into the topic.
Okay, perfect. Good. Okay, so let's begin with the top trends. Do you want to lead us off here, Paul? You've been doing some thinking about these top trends.
Well, that'd be great. And I think, Liz, what would be good is if we could go back and forth on these, because sure, you've also contributed to these, and you've got some of your thinking, and you're much better at understanding trends. I'm kind of put my head down and work at the moment kind of guy, and I love the trends that you've got here, and I think the one that I added here, or maybe the two I added here, was the first one for me was I'm somewhat surprised this year in their renewed interest in community engagement. And I do think it's come out of the collective impact work. What we've been finding as collective impact has moved from an idea that people are adopting to an idea that people are implementing, they're realizing that in order to do the common agenda work well, they have to get good at community engagement. And this is an important trend for me, because what we had sort of seen is that community engagement, people had been doing it for a while, they were starting to get tired of it, maybe the communities were getting tired of it, and we were moving back into some older trends in which we were doing community development work in a much quicker way, trying to get quick results, quick wins, rather than deeply engaging our community in the issue. I'll talk about this later on a little bit more, but that for me has been a key trend. Another one that has been, obviously, that we've been following is the growing interest in community itself. But again, I'll talk more about that later in terms of my learning, and we call it here deepening community. But what we're finding is that neighborhood renewal has really moved onto the agenda this year. A lot of cities are hiring neighborhood directors. They're implementing their neighborhood plans. It's exciting to see. And my sense is for 215, we're going to really see this one grow. And I think there's going to be a number of new thinkers out there that are going to be building on John McKnight's work, that are going to be building on the work that's come out of Harvard through Robert Putnam. These are kind of thoughts that are being renewed, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later as well. How about you, Liz? What are you seeing as some of the key trends from 214 moving into 215?
Yeah, I think I would agree with you, Paul, in terms of this renewed interest in community engagement. For me, the one thing that has really dominated my work over the last year is just this growing interest in collective impact as a framework for community change, and really people trying to get their minds wrapped around how this framework is different from all the other community change models that are out there, and there are significant number of them that are out there, right? And I think that, we'll talk a little bit more about this, but collective impact is one of those ideas that has caught fire, and certainly, from funders to community organizations to collaborative planning tables, it is one of those strategies, one of those frameworks that people can say, yeah, I understand the core concepts of collective impact, the challenges in application, for sure. I think this community engagement trend that you're seeing, what I have noticed is, people struggle with how do we bring some of those unusual voices around these collective impact tables or around these community engagement tables, and what are some of the challenges when you bring business to the table or include the voice of people with lived experience in these processes. How do we do that effectively, and what are some of the strategies that we could put into place that really creates and shares power amongst the different voices around the table? And I think we do have to be much more intentional in both our design of how we're going to do that, but also intentional about how we think that the diverse voices will add value in a real kind of way. The other thing that I'm seeing connected to collective impact, but not necessarily always so, is focus on, evaluation in terms of outcomes, and then getting our minds wrapped around how do we, not only move programmatic outcomes in our community, but how do we also begin to shift, the community in a way that we are thinking about shared measurement and trying to get at some of those population level outcomes, which is, really challenging, but there are lots of emerging examples that we can actually draw from. In Canada, we have the vital signs reports that are done in a number of communities across Canada. We have the Canadian Index of Wellbeing. So there are more and more shared measurement platforms. So we don't have to reinvent the wheel. Let's begin to look at and leverage some of those. And then the final trend that I've noticed is this whole set of work around implementing design thinking into our practice, whether it's around community change, collective impact, impact investing, and there are a number of examples of social innovation labs, design thinking labs that our colleagues at Social Innovation Generation and, Rios Partners and others across Canada are really putting into, the work that we're doing. And I think that that will be a trend that we'll continue to watch and evolve over time. So those are some of the top trends from my perspective. Shall we move on to the next slide?
Yeah, I like those trends, Liz, and it'd be interesting to hear from learners online just what they're seeing. Are they seeing any other trends? And it'd be fabulous to hear from you in your boxes. In the Q&A area here. I love it.
Yeah. So now we're going to move on to some of our lessons learned, Paul, and we've split this up into your lessons learned and my lessons learned. And I think, part of what we were trying to do, because you've been focusing a lot on community engagement, deepening community, collective impact perspectives, and I've been doing work around evaluation and collective impact. So we've got some different lessons learned in each of the areas. But why don't you start? Why don't you kind of muse for a couple of minutes on, what you've been learning over the course of 2014?
Great, Liz. Well, I've got three of them here, and I've got a surprise, something that surprised me this year. And maybe I'll share those after yours. Maybe we can end this section with it, because it's been quite profound for me, actually. So I'm going to go back again to this notion of community engagement and the renewal that's happening. I've been finding people wanting to implement a community engagement strategy, and there seems to be a tiredness about the why. Why should we do this? The tiredness isn't about tired of hearing it, but people are tired of hearing just that. What they're much more interested in now is how. How do you do it? And they're realizing that when they're going out and doing it, it takes time, it's a lot of work, and it's not always effective. And they're also finding out that if they don't take the time, if they don't put the work in it, it's frustrating for them and for the people that they're trying to engage. So it's the how becomes really important to people. They want tools, they want methods, and they don't want a method, they want methods that they can engage in, that they can work in. And so I'm finding that when we're out talking about community engagement, they're very interested in this notion of conversation. Okay, so not that we do it, but how do you do it? How do you bring groups of people together? And how do you create a set of questions? How do you create a process? And is there a methodology in order for those conversations to be effective over time? What I'm finding is that people are interested in that because when they just hold conversations, people don't seem to be engaged. But when conversations are held with really good questions, open-ended ones, when processes are being followed that promote good conversation, they're successful and people become engaged. We also recently held a seminar. Lisa Adegali and myself held a seminar on community engagement, and Lisa was particularly focusing on, most of the day, she was focusing on online engagement and using technology to engage, and people were just fascinated by that. And again, it's an important learning for us that it's not that people don't want to do engagement. What they want is really effective engagement. And so we're going to really look at that next year and see how we can create better tools and webinars and seminars that give people that practical knowledge. So stay tuned for that. And we're hoping to be in Edmonton in the fall, running a 3-day event, just looking at putting those practical tools into people's hands. Now, there's an interesting observation I've had around collective impact. And as you know, Liz, collective impact has caught on fire. It's hotter now than it's ever been, and it's much more than a trend. And I think people are beginning to see it differently. So this is what my key learning has been this year, and part of it came out of John Kanya's talk at the Collective Impact Summit. And it's this this understanding that collective impact is much more than a methodology. Maybe, and I shouldn't maybe say this publicly, but I sometimes think of it as a fairly simple methodology. It's so intuitive. When we think of the 5 principles and even the preconditions, they're intuitive to us, which is why we are so many of us are elevating to it, because it's putting into language what we've been thinking for so long. But it doesn't work as a methodology. It works better as a thinking system, as a way of being. It's a belief system. And so when you start to look at collective impact as a belief system, you see that a common agenda is the bringing together of people and energy that those people represent and ideas that those people represent. It's not just a plan that we agree to, that we raise our hands and say yes to. So it's about moving a group of people, and then it's being committed in our hearts and in our minds that this type of a common agenda, this common energy, and taking the time to focus that is important. It's important not only to get better results, but it's an important way of believing that the work needs to be done. So many of us who've worked on asset-based community development approach, that we've been thinking about communities collaborating, it's not just about getting a result, it's about getting people to work together and to be together. So it's a commitment to that, more than just a commitment to the methodologies that work. So it's a way of being, right? It's an understanding that shared measurement is more than measuring things, right? It's not just about measuring things, it's about having good data in order for us to support things, because our minds, we make up our mind on things very quickly. And so, and particularly as groups, we need this shared data in order to make better decisions. And so it's a belief in that type of thing. And I could go through the 5 conditions, but I think there's this notion that we have our own work to do as leaders if we are going to be effective in this collective impact work. That takes me to my 3rd key learning, and it came from primarily Peter Block as we were doing the Community Policies and Programs event in June, in which about 170 people gathered from across the country and through the United States and even beyond, asking the question, what's the value of community in the building of community? And Peter Block said this, gave us this idea. And the idea was community has a job to do. Wow, that's so interesting. What does that mean? And what do we, when we put community into the first person, what does it mean that community has a job to do? Right? And so the job that community has to do is to keep the peace. When we have a sense of community, when we're together, when we know one another. It is a form of organizing ourselves for effectiveness. It takes care of our loneliness, or at least it helps us get through it. And the list goes on. And so we started to identify what are the jobs that community has to do. And then we went one step further and we said, well, those are the jobs of community. Now, what are the policies and programs that we can implement in our cities in order for that kind of community to become more likely? That goes back to my trend about neighborhoods, investing in neighborhoods, investing in thinking like neighborhoods. But also we started to see what are some of those, and Sherry Torgman released a great paper this year that took that and started to do some framing and some framework around community and its job that it has to do, and particularly looking at that could work toward it. And I know Kirsty, when she puts together the post email, she'll be including this paper from Sherry Torgman, and maybe also the foreword that Peter Block wrote for my latest book on deepening community, and allowing us to see there this very, very important understanding. And for us, it means a whole new direction around how we're going to try to advance this idea and importance of community. Liz, I'm going to leave my surprise to the end. So why don't we move now to your lessons and things that you've learned, unless you have any comments on the ones that I've shared.
Yeah, I think we can move on to mine, but I think some of mine actually are consistent with yours as well, you know, particularly the ones about collective impact. I think I would agree with you that it isn't, in some ways it's a framework, but in many ways it is about, you know, us as leaders and the role that we have to play in all of that. You know, some of my lessons are reflecting on, you know, what we're trying to do at Tamarack in terms of this idea of co-generation of knowledge for social change. And, you know, we know that we have lots of people that are engaged with Tamarack and really find us a valuable kind of go-to resource. We found that out when we did our survey earlier this year. But it's hard when you're involved on the ground work to kind of lift your head up one stage higher and say, how is the work that I'm doing, how can it contribute to building the field and building the knowledge of the field? And I want to spend a second just really thanking everybody who's done that, because we have seen a growing trend across our 3 learning communities of people sharing, you know, their knowledge and their tools and their resources. But it is one of those things, right, that we have to, you know, that we have to balance the day-to-day doing with this idea that, you know, we are contributing to this field of practice, this field of community change, and it is a challenge for us. But I think that we all benefit when we contribute. So that's one of the things I think we'll continue to muse about at Tamarack as we continue to look at the role that Tamarack plays in the community. But one thing that I'd also, for the people that are on the call, that I'd also challenge you to think about, yeah, you're doing really great work, but how do we share that work? How do we recognize the really great work that you're doing, and what role can you play in that generation of knowledge? The second surprising trend to me, so you have a surprise, and this is the surprise for me that I've had this year. Tamarack started to work and started to engage a number of thought leaders in our 3 learning communities. And initially I was a bit resistant to this, I have to admit, to the folks on the call. Because I thought, oh, it's one more thing to do, and I'm really busy, and how do I, you know, and all those things that we put up, all the barriers that we put up around ourselves when we're incredibly busy. And yet, I have to say that the engagement of thought leaders in the work of Tamarack has been really quite phenomenal, and really quite a shift in the way that we are, or not a shift, because I think we've always really looked to the field and looked to, you know, key practitioners to help us think through some trends and things like that. But it really has enriched our conversations at Tamarack and our conversations with thought leaders. And it's frankly the thing I look forward to the most now are the calls with our thought leaders in our different communities to find out about what they're thinking about and what they're learning and some of the big ideas that they're considering. And, you know, I would say to the folks on the call, think about this in terms of your own work. Who are the people that you're drawing into your work that, you know, maybe will take you outside of the kind of confines of your thinking? How do you bring them on board? How do you engage them in a conversation? And it's, you know, I would say try to bring in people that will stretch you a bit and that are maybe not the people that you talk to all the time, but people that you recognize in your field of practice. People are very generous with their time, and so that's been a great, I think, opportunity for us at Tamarack, and through Tamarack, I think a great opportunity for all of you, and I know it's one that we're going to continue to explore as we move forward. My third point is my third lesson learned actually aligns really nicely with your practice over purpose and being over doing points, Paul. And I think this is about balancing content and context. And, you know, there's a great quote that we use that comes from Peter Drucker, that culture eats strategy for breakfast, right? So it is really that context that we have to pay attention to. So we can have, you know, the best strategy, the best framework, you know, or what we think is going to move us forward as an organization, but we have to pay attention to both our internal context and also the external forces that are around us that may shift us in one direction or another. And it's really an opportunity, once we're kind of more in tune with that, it's an opportunity for us to say, okay, so what are those forces that are positive for us that we can leverage and jump on like wind blowing us in a certain direction? And what are some of those forces that are maybe more negative that we need to be paying attention to? And then how do we bring even those negative forces in to think about, those negative contextual issues to think about, so that we can even spend a bit more time solidifying, you know, where we want to land in moving this forward. So that for me has been a bit of a continuing theme, the content and context, and I think it's particularly related to collective impact, because while it's a broad framework and they have broad conditions, how people are learning about those conditions, implementing them in their local communities, context is king in those, in what I've seen move forward in a whole bunch of communities across Canada and the United States, Australia and other places. The fourth lesson is this idea of, and you know, something that I've really kind of been watching is, you know, how an idea can catch fire and what happens when they catch fire. And so this actually is connected to the next lesson learned around Snapback. So sometimes when a powerful idea catches fire, our inclination is, oh no, that's the way we've always been working, or there's nothing new in that idea, or let's not do thought leadership because we're really busy, you know. So we internalize some of these things, these new ideas, and we don't embrace them, but instead we snap back into our old ways of working as a little bit of a protective factor, right? Because, you know, community change work is really hard. And so I think we got to watch out for that. But the other thing that I want to kind of say around the power of new ideas is that there, you know, I have a certain amount of curiosity in the way that I work, and so I'm always really interested in looking at ideas and looking which ones catch fire and which ones don't, and, you know, really trying to think about, okay, for my work at Tamarack, what are the lessons that we can learn, you know, around both these ideas and the catching of fire of them, but also some of the reaction, some of that snapback reaction that is happening out there in the community, and what are the lessons, the deeper lessons that we can learn from that. And then finally, snapback. So those of you that joined us at the Collective Impact Summit heard this idea from Brenda Zimmerman, and you know, it's the one that has been rolling around in my brain for the last couple of months. And, you know, Brenda, I hope I will share it with you in a way that does honor to her idea. But her idea essentially is that collective impact or community change or this work that we're doing is very fragile, right? And it's about working differently and thinking differently and being differently collectively together and trying to move systems. So there's individual snapback and there's organizational snapback. And I gave you some examples of individual snapback where we go, oh, this is too hard, or, oh, I don't have the time, or I don't have the energy for this. Those are some examples of individual snapback. And then there's organizational snapback where, we're funded to do work in a certain way, or we have to measure in a certain way, or our organization doesn't have the time or the capacity to free up the resources to work in this new kind of collaborative way, or this is how we're always doing our work. Those are some examples, not an exhaustive list of snapback. So I think what Brenda said, or at least what I heard Brenda say, is that this snapback exists both individually and organizationally, and it's going to be really hard to change. But what we can do is that we can recognize it in ourselves and our organizations. And when we're trying to work differently, when we're trying to move communities forward, when we're trying to be part of the solution, let's pay attention to snapback, watch it happen, and then figure out strategies that will continue to help us move forward. So those are some of the lessons. I don't know that I've learned them completely, Paul. I think that they're more lessons in process for me, and ones that I will continue to reflect on in 2015. Are we ready to go to your surprise, or is that going to come at the end?
Well, that's going to come at the end, but I want to talk a little bit about your lessons learned here, and I think this idea of snapback is an interesting one, and I'm going to encourage Kirsty to also include a video that we've produced from Brenda Zimmerman's talk at the Collective Impact Summit. And I know that Lisa is going to cringe here because she's going to want it to come out and engage first. But I think that these individuals who come onto this webinar should take a look at that and get that concept earlier, just as a way of saying thanks for coming online. It was a very important idea for us, and maybe in some ways for Brenda a warning. And Brenda's one of the foremost experts in complexity science, and when she understands when large systems change, they do snap back, and it was a warning to us, as we're working on this idea of large systems change. There are entrenched systems that they kind of stretch, and it looks like they're changing, but really what they're doing is they're just stretching. And then when they stretch too far, boom, a lot of what we've done, we lose.
Yeah.
The idea of thought leadership and just generally the power of ideas, I think those are two that really work together for me. And it's interesting because as much as I'm interested in the leader, the thought leader, I'm interested in leadership, and that is about groups that are leading together, so that in a sense, it's the momentum of an idea that causes common movement, common shifting. And so it's kind of like leadership, or the leaderful communities where there's a lot of leaders that have caught an idea, and the thought leadership is actually a common commitment to an idea. And so in that sense, thought leadership is not just about the idea of an individual, but it's the ideas of a collective coming together. And I think it's just very, very powerful. That's fantastic. I'd love to hear from people that are online today, their questions and their thoughts and comments and trends.
I know that Kirsty and Lisa have been monitoring some of those. I've seen the dialogue box appear. Maybe Lisa, do you have any that you want to share with us?
Kirsty's been the one monitoring it, so Kirsty, please jump in if you have something. I can have a quick look now.
Absolutely, I have a couple here. So Ashraful Hassan asks, It seems to me that collective impact evaluation is very much connected with equity-focused evaluation. Both use developmental and realist evaluation. Where are they similar and how are they different? And can we merge the two?
Liz, why don't you take that one?
Yeah. So I think you're right about that. I think that the collective impact evaluation has, in its formative stages in collective impact work, developmental evaluation is really a great approach in terms of thinking through, what do we want to evaluate in real time that shows that we're making progress on a number of measures that are, about the initiative itself and about the context in which the initiative exists, those kinds of things. And I think realist evaluation speaks to that as well. The FSG, Social Impact Consultants, did release this year 3 guides to evaluating collective impact. And, one of the most useful things in the guides is they looked at the different phases of collective impact as they move forward. And they looked at, what are the action things that the collective impact collaborative should be thinking about, what are performance measures, and then what's the evaluation approach. And they're suggesting in early stage it's developmental, in mid-stage it's formative, and then in late stage it's summative. What we've learned through Vibrant Communities is that a developmental approach has been very helpful in terms of the evaluation design for Vibrant Communities. So I don't know if that's helpful or not, but that's just some of the lessons that we've learned in our approach to shared measurement, evaluation, and collective impact. I know that we only have a few more minutes left, and so I just wanted to bring up our last slide about, upcoming Tamarack learning events and encourage folks to go onto our website to find out more details about these. Any final reflections, Paul, for you from this call?
I'm just really grateful that so many people have joined us today. Over 250 people registered, and I'm really excited. I hope that people can be tweeting out on your Twitter trends that you email us directly. We'd love that, and we'll just gather them together and let's go into 215. With a lot of hope. So many great people trying to make the world a better place.
Absolutely. What about Kirsty or Lisa? One really quick thought from each of you. Kirsty?
It's a good question.
I've got one. I'll jump right in. This is Lisa.
Oh, okay. Go ahead.
Yeah, one of the trends that I saw coming across in the question box was the observation about open data. And it's something, I was at the Community Knowledge Exchange a few weeks ago, and that was just everyone was talking about open data and what would happen if we all, if we shared our information more freely, how we could solve some of these big problems. So I think that's a trend we'll continue to watch.
Yeah, absolutely, and thanks whoever shared that for sharing, and thanks Lisa for bringing that up. Kirsty?
Well, the trend around collective impact, I know both of you have talked about collective impact, Liz and Paul, but it's a hot topic still, and there's a ton of questions around that, and I'm excited to see what 2015 has to bring in the area, in the field of collective impact.
Yeah, and I think my final reflection as we begin to end this call is to really just thank everybody for your participation in both the work that you do in your communities. I think it's wise words, Paul, from that participant in Saskatoon about the fact, and John Kenya, of course, the fact that we have to open our hearts and not get so down to the technical, how do we do this, but to think that it is about the heart work as well. And I think, at Tamarack, one of the things that I'll reflect on as we go into the new year is just the great opportunity that we have to learn from all of you. I think we can make a commitment, Paul, you and I, to looking at any questions that got raised in the chat box over the course of the call, and in the email that we'll be sending to all of you in a couple of days, we'll share both the questions and the trends and reflections that you all shared with us as we went through this call. And with that, I guess, Paul, are we ready to close up?
Just again, thanks everyone.